So it's pretty obvious that the United States is screwing everything up, right? Whether we're talking about our client state Israel that is committing obscene atrocities in like 5 countries now, or whether we're talking about the tragedy in Ukraine that I would argue, did the most to bring about and certainly didn't avert, and the fact that Washington, D.C. is constantly promising to bring about a similar tragedy around Taiwan. Things don't look great. The world is sort of spinning off of its axis, and the United States is the main driver. The United States and our client states are the main driver in all of this. Now, I really don't like this. I don't even really like talking about this as much as I do, but I feel that I have to. I'm an American patriot, or I'm a U.S. patriot, if that's a more woke way to put it. Like, I love my country. I want my country to do well. I want my country to win, actually. Like, I want my country to beat China. I want my country to beat all of our rivals, because I do think that there are things about my country that are worthwhile, that do provide a worthwhile model for the world. I'm selfish. Like, I want my country to do well. And it's incredibly frustrating to look at the world that we have made. I get so sick when people are like, oh, Rob, you're always blaming America. Yes, I blame America because we are responsible. We have been in control of this planet since 1917, and most everything, growing control of this planet since 1917, and certainly since 1945. And when things go wrong, especially when things go wrong that are inspired by our obvious client states, it is America's fault. It is our responsibility. America is not the great villain or the great hero. America just is. We're in charge. We're in control. Now, the happy news is that it's actually really easy for the United States to win. In fact, we can do some really basic things. Don't even really have to change that much to continue to win. Most of the things we need to do to really guarantee eventual U.S. victory over China, the sort of perpetuation of the U.S. empire, are things that we have to do internally. We do have to talk about enemies. We have to talk about a tremendous threat, a tremendous source of danger, a tremendous threat to the U.S. way of life, to U.S. empire, to U.S. Continuation. And that threat is internal. That threat is the U.S. military-industrial complex. I'm talking about the thousands, tens of thousands of folks who are operating in and around the Pentagon, in and around our intelligence communities, in and around our foreign policy establishment. They are obviously the problem. The United States is built to win. The United States is almost shockingly well endowed with resources, well endowed with people, and most importantly, the fact that everybody from all over the world still wants to come here. The thing that has been screwing us up, that is creating nightmares, that is creating damage, is the U.S. military-industrial complex. I've been following this closely for about 20 years now. I finished university when more or less exactly when the towers came down. That was September of my senior year in college. I've been following foreign policy ever since, and I've gone through 2 waves now of incredibly stupid U.S. military-industrial complex policy, military-driven policy that has been an abject failure. First, we had the war on terror, which is a spectacular failure. It was dedicated to protecting the Saudi architects of 9/11, and is colossal failure. We now have Al-Qaeda in control of Syria. It just failed on every metric imaginable, killed, I'd say, literally millions. Obscene disaster. And in 2017, the U.S. military-industrial complex made a decision to make it even worse. We are living in the era of great power competition. What nobody wants to point out, and I think more journalists would be pointing out, if we hadn't had the Trump show for the past 10 years that sucks up all the oxygen, is that what we're seeing with Israel and Iran, with Ukraine and Russia, with Taiwan and China, is explicit U.S. policy. Like back in 2017, 2018, this thing called great power competition was the United States putting in writing, we want more wars with great powers. I reject that Russia and China are those things, but we want more wars with Russia, China, Iran, etc. And we've gotten it. Like, this is actually the successful following of written U.S. policy, the fact that the world seems to be dissolving into wars right now. This is obviously insane. I thought it might make sense to break in here and provide a very real example of what I'm talking about from the here and now. The U.S. public does not want to go to war in Iran. The U.S. president was elected in November largely on his promise to not start any new wars. Over the past few months, we've seen battles in the Trump administration between the war hawks and the more peace-oriented people. It seemed like the pro-peace camp had won. Trump was even negotiating a peace deal with Iran. So why does everybody expect full-on war between the United States and Iran over the next 24 hours? The anti-Semites are having a field day with this, understandably. Israel's leader Netanyahu clearly ignored Trump's wishes and started a war designed to draw the United States in. Israel and its loathsome superfans in the United States are practically bragging about how they have dragged the U.S. into this war largely against our will. These pieces of garbage are useful targets, but they're not the greatest villain here. The greatest villain is Michael Kurilla, the head of CENTCOM, the United States Central Command. Have you heard of CENTCOM? All U.S. citizens should have, because it's our largest, most expensive, and most damaging bad habit. Central Command is one of the most powerful centers of the U.S. military-industrial complex. It runs U.S. military operations in the Middle East, which means, basically, that CENTCOM has run the Middle East for the past 35 years. Bibi Netanyahu, Israel's disgusting government, and the violent military technology industry that has taken over Israel is much more a product of CENTCOM than anything the Israeli people wanted. CENTCOM's two failed wars in Iraq and Afghanistan alone are responsible for $6 trillion out of our $36 trillion national debt. Netanyahu launched this war against Trump's wishes, but he had the full support of Michael Kurilla, nominally a U.S. general. The U.S. may not start bombing Iran until today, but the second Netanyahu launched Friday's attack on Iran, he knew that Michael Kurilla would have his back. Over the past 5 days, we've already spent billions defending Israel from Iranian retaliation. And we will continue doing that no matter what Trump decides. Of course, Trump's decision is heavily influenced by the fact that Michael Kurilla is already putting all the necessary resources in place for Trump to make the worst and most violent decision. You don't actually think drunk-ass Pete Hegseth is calling the shots right now, do you? It seems pretty clear to me that Michael Kurilla is one of the greatest traitors in United States history. But he's not working for Israel. This blood-soaked course will eventually be just as catastrophic for Israel as it has been for all of its neighbors. Kurilla is working for the U.S.'s greatest enemy, the U.S. military-industrial complex. He knows that he can defy Trump and the will of the American people because the vast majority of the U.S. Congress primarily works for the U.S. military-industrial complex as well. This is obviously insane, and it makes me feel a little bit crazy that, it almost seems like I'm the only person talking about this. But this is actually like a happy video. This is like a good news video, because I want to just sort of go through U.S. history and explain how actually this militarist enemy has had nothing to do with our success. And the United States, the U.S. people, the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. system is almost guaranteed to win if we can just defeat our biggest enemy, which is the U.S. military-industrial complex. So in order to do that, I've got a video I put out in, I guess, 2017 or 2018. And I think 2017 or 20, maybe it was 2018. Can't quite recall. And this, it was 2018. That just goes through U.S. history and how the United States actually won and how the military had almost nothing to do with it. I guess let's roll that clip.
Hey there. So why has the United States managed to keep winning for so long? Whether you like it or not, the fact that the U.S. has done pretty well for the past 200 years is worth examining. There are about 1 million ways to look at this issue, and there are a whole bunch of other factors that are really important, but today I'd like to look at the main reason the United States has done so well. Immigration. In the year 1800, the United States was a tiny country, made up of a little over 5 million people. It was dwarfed and surrounded by the British, Spanish, and French empires. The U.S. barely even had a navy in 1800. If you had to choose the winner in the competition for victory in the Americas back then, you probably wouldn't have chosen the U.S.
What I didn't emphasize in this video, and that I should, is that this is the last real point of danger in U.S. history. Like, this is the last point where the United States was actually threatened by any of the threats that we keep talking about. The British Empire was the greatest danger that the United States ever faced. From its inception all the way down to the early 20th century, the British were really the only power. I mean, British probably couldn't really impact us after the Civil War or thereabouts, or maybe a few decades before, but the British were a real threat to the United States, and it was a real threat that the United States surmounted. I mean, in the War of 1812, the British burnt down the White House. Like, they actually had the potential to take U.S. territory, the potential to overthrow our government, burn down the White House. Terrifyingly scary stuff. And I think it's worth pointing out that, like, we never had a standing army to deal with that. When we needed to build the resources to deal with the British threat in, like, real conflicts, we did so. And, won. Did very well. We did have a navy that we had built up before the War of 1812 that did rather well, but the crushing defeat of British soldiers, British regulars, that ended the War of 1812 and gave us Andrew Jackson, for better or worse, was not standing military forces. It was forces that were called up for the war. This is like a key dynamic across the 19th century, which was I would say, vastly more successful century in terms of actually taking and holding territory than the 20th or the 21st for a variety of reasons. But we didn't have a standing military that did that broadly. We had, of course, we had West Point. We did always have generals and whatnot. But if you compare the period before World Wars I and II to the period after World Wars I and II, we basically didn't have a military. For the U.S. Civil War, which was an incredible effort, the militaries were called up. For the Mexican-American War, which was a larger effort, the militaries were called up. And that's another sort of interesting dynamic here in these 19th century wars. When the United States won a war, it was in a context where we were so obviously transparently dominant over the people we were going up against. The U.S. Civil War is basically lasted as long as it did because we had a horrible general in charge of the Union military for a year or two that just didn't want to fight. The U.S. Civil War was pretty much guaranteed to end in a Northern victory. The Mexican-American War was pretty much guaranteed to end in a U.S. victory. So it's just this grand old history, not to minimize the incredible sacrifices of the men and women who actually fought in these conflicts. But the idea that there's this military tradition had won us these victories. No, it's the size of the United States and having the good sense to only get in conflicts with people that we could easily defeat.
But the United States grew. By 1900, the U.S. had 76 million people, and it had won the battle for North America. Its numbers gave it the ability to dominate South America as well. The question now was whether or not the United States would be able to be a major player in the world and spread its influence beyond the continent it was on. It faced European empires that were much more technologically advanced than they had been 100 years earlier. They now had instantaneous communication and massive battleships. Those empires dwarfed the U.S. population. But the United States grew. By 1950, the U.S. had 152 million people, and most of those grand empires were falling apart. The question now was whether the U.S. could prevail against its greatest threat ever, the massive Soviet Empire. The Soviets had over 50 million more people than the United States, and tens of millions more in countries they controlled. It didn't look good for the U.S.
So you guys may have noticed that I didn't make a big deal about World Wars One and Two there, and that's for a pretty good reason. Like that's another one of those guaranteed win situations. Yes, obviously because we're titanic, horrific, horrible struggles. But if you look back, even like the Japanese generals knew that, like, if they, or one admiral specifically, knew that if they actually got the United States to care about this conflict, they were guaranteed to lose. The truly impressive thing that the United States did after it established its control of the U.S. continent was defeating the British Empire in the rest of the world, taking over from the British and the French empires. The Japanese and the Germans, nasty, savage, little gross polities that were in part so savage and gross because they knew they were far behind and felt that, oh, we're going to be stronger and crazier and madman policy or whatever. And were crushed by us because of the strength of the U.S. economy, because of the strength of what the United States did. As we moved into the Cold War, you can really see the beginning after World War I and World War II. This is why World War II is most important, is because it gave incredible power to the U.S.'s biggest enemy, which is the military-industrial complex. It created, for the first time, a true standing military in the United States, and it really screwed us over pretty much from the get-go. The last successful military endeavor that the United States had was the Korean War. I believe that actually was a straightforward example of the newly flushed with U.S. cash from World War II, communist world deciding, we're going to shoot our shot. We're going to see if we can use military strength to take over a country. And the U.S. military stopped that. I think that was like the last useful thing that the U.S. military has done. And that was what, 80 years ago, almost? The challenge that the United States was facing with the Soviet Union was of a very different character than these old imperial struggles. The Soviets were larger. The Soviets had a ideology that was attractive. Up until 1917, the United States always got to be like the most revolutionary kid on the block. All of a sudden, the Soviets were coming into this world where most of the world was becoming independent from European empires, and the United States was on the side of the European empires, and the Soviets were coming in and saying, hey, we've got this new fandangled system that's going to liberate you from all of these nasty European folks. So it was kind of close run there, and the Soviets had more people than we did. So what we did through the 1930s to the 1970s is we got smarter. We got smarter with U.S. tax policy. We got smarter with U.S. regulation. We got smarter with U.S. economic management, and we produced the one of the most extraordinary economic miracles in human history, societal miracles. The period from the 1930s to the 1970s certainly had lots of problems around civil rights, around women's rights, this, that, and the other thing. But all of those metrics were improving from the 1930s to the 1970s. And it was one of the most impressive economies in human history, one of the more equal economies in human history. All Americans, including disfavored minorities, all the boats were being lifted from the 1930s to the 1970s by sound tax policy, sound economic policy. This is the ideology that quite literally got us to the moon. And by I would argue by the 1950s, but certainly by the 1960s and 70s, the Soviet model had been clearly outpaced. The Cold War was sort of sputtering out. And what happened? What saved the Soviet Union that kept the Cold War going into the 1980s? The U.S. military-industrial complex and the intellectuals around it deciding that we had to keep the French Empire propped up in Vietnam. And that incredible misstep lasted 20 years and extended the Cold War. And we basically defeated ourselves. The Soviets didn't beat us in Vietnam. The U.S. military-industrial complex did. As we can see by the fact that Vietnam, communist Vietnam, is now actually a pretty close ally of the United States. None of this had to happen. But that's what the military-industrial complex does. It screws us up. It screws us over.
It didn't look good for the U.S. But the United States grew. By 2017, the U.S. had 325 million people. Even if it hadn't broken up, the United States would still be a larger country than the Soviet Union today. Continued immigration to the United States has always given it the resources it has needed to overcome all rivals. But now we face a different challenge.
So we defeated the Soviets. The Soviet Union no longer exists. We did not defeat the military-industrial complex. And part of like the death throes of that military-industrial complex as their ability to fight the Soviets was dissipating in the 1980s, that military-industrial complex took actions that led to 9/11, which led to the perpetuation of the military-industrial complex. That may sound like a bit conspiracy theory-ish, but if you actually look into it, it's just documented history. The Soviet Union was already collapsing. What actually finished the Soviet Union off in the 1980s was the boomerang from the oil crisis. The oil crisis in the 1970s gave them a ton more resources because the Soviet Union, as Russia is today, was a petrostate. And then, thanks to Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve, a lot more than anything that Ronald Reagan did, those oil prices crashed in the 1980s. And all of a sudden, the Soviet Union had a bad system, and then it had a bankrupt bad system. That's sort of how the Soviet Union finally ended. But the military-industrial complex really wanted to jump in there and say it was doing something. So what it did was it worked with the Saudis and the Pakistanis to create a huge jihadi subculture to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. And that was successful. Ooh, big deal. Yeah, we managed to do that. And then we let Afghanistan fall into complete horrific chaos. Out of that complete horrific chaos, and US CIA funding and Saudi funding and Pakistani funding that was not just allowed, but encouraged by the United States, that's where we got Al-Qaeda. That's where we got the most horrific attack on the United States of this century. That's where we got 9/11, was because the U.S. military-industrial complex couldn't just let the Soviet Union fall in the 1980s. It had to get its hand in and do its cool, fun military stuff. And in the process, created 9/11 and guaranteed continued success for the military-industrial complex, the greatest enemy of the United States.
But now we face a different challenge. China isn't some flash-in-the-pan European empire. From long before the Romans down to the 1800s, China's population made it the most powerful country on Earth. It now expects to have that status renewed. Will it happen? Well, that's up to U.S. policymakers.
So China does look pretty intimidating, but I think if you just look back on the history we've just reviewed and what the United States has already surmounted, the British Empire that controlled the whole world, the Soviet Union that had, at least initially, a more attractive ideology than the United States did. China it's just a matter of time. If we just focus on ourselves, make ourselves more powerful, more just, more successful, it's really just a matter of time before we surpass China as well. Now, obviously, to get away with that, we must rein in our greatest enemy, the U.S. military-industrial complex. Obviously, if we allow ourselves to fall into another $1 trillion war in the Middle East, as we are now hurtling towards as we speak, that's going to make it a lot easier for China. Obviously, if we allow World War III to start over Taiwan, then the things look a lot worse for the United States. It's the United States that benefits from not doing war, which makes it so perverse that we've allowed our greatest enemy, the U.S. military-industrial complex, to push us into so many wars all over the world. It's frankly insane. But here's good news. It's really straightforward how we can surpass these countries. It's quite straightforward, and I illustrated that in this video from 7 years back. Now, I think people complain a lot about this Rob versus Rob series, where I tend to go back to videos from 3, 5, 10 years back and just highlight how I agree with everything I said, and I'm completely consistent, and that's not true. Things have changed. Things have changed fairly seriously. And I think that the solution I present here is incomplete. And I'll get to why the solution I present in this clip is incomplete after the clip.
Will it happen? Well, that's up to U.S. policymakers. This is why I get defensive about U.S. immigration and why I think its opponents are kind of nuts. My support for immigration isn't about kumbaya multiculturalism or feel-good diversity stuff. U.S. history shows that all of that fades pretty quickly. Assimilation is a powerful thing. Immigration is about power. And those who seek to limit immigration to the United States are trying to undermine U.S. power. Immigration to the United States is already at historically low levels, and elements of the Trump administration are working hard to get them even lower. Congress has been able to block Trump's worst ideas so far, but ambitious foreign students are already choosing to go elsewhere. I spent a lot of time mocking Washington, D.C.'s invented threats, but there is one threat that I don't make fun of. The story of the 21st century is likely to be the rivalry between the United States and China. The best way to keep that rivalry peaceful is to keep up with China's growth, or at least not fall too far behind. The United States doesn't need to be the size of China, though our continent-sized country could easily support that with a few technical fixes. No, the United States just needs to keep pace and stay in the game until China's period of extreme growth ends, which it is already doing. U.S. immigration is U.S. power.
So how is this wrong? It's incomplete. I think 7 years ago, I was much more naively confident in the U.S.'s ability to not break our immigration engine. We are now in our second Donald Trump presidency. The amounts of migration to the United States are plummeting. Basic tourism isn't happening anymore. The unleashed Gestapo of the Department of Homeland Security is making life incredibly unpleasant for anybody who might want to come to the United States. That is obviously nightmarish. And that's basically, if you want to destroy the United States, if you want to serve China, you would be doing exactly what Donald Trump is doing on immigration. You would be starting fights against our greatest economic hubs and like Los Angeles or New York over the topic of migration. If you Donald Trump is obviously a huge servant of China with his immigration policy. That's transparently obvious. But I think that's harder to break. The U.S. immigration engine has been broken before, back in the 1920s. It sort of tends to bounce back. Because it really is in our DNA to be a nation of immigrants. What I'm not as confident about, as I was confident about 7 years ago, is the U.S. system more broadly. It was a difficult challenge to defeat the Soviet Union with its fresh new ideology. And what we did was we reorganized the United States around economic success and economic growth. That period from the 1930s to the 1970s, the New Deal era, for lack of a better word, wasn't just more economically just. It wasn't more more economically equal. It was dramatically more economically successful. It's pretty straightforward. You look at the 1930s to the 1970s and you compare the 1970s to today as far as broad economic growth in the United States, and 1930s and 1970s win massively. There are some structural reasons behind that, but fundamentally, from the 1930s to the 1970s, we organized the United States economy, tax policy, industrial policy to win. From the 1970s to 2025, we've been organizing the U.S. Using all those tools of organization that were developed between the 1930s and the 1970s to make people richer, to make a small class of people richer. U.S. economic growth has suffered during the Reagan era. It's been much less successful, but the wealth of a certain class of people in the United States, sort of the top 20%, has accelerated dramatically. So if we want to beat China, beat Iran, beat everybody else, remain the hegemon of the world for centuries to come, we do need to stop doing Donald Trump's sort of China-serving immigration policy. We need to stop breaking our immigration engine. But I do think that like that's a easier lift. But what we also need to do is we need to get back to that great New Deal era of U.S. prosperity. If we want to truly beat China in this competition, we need to be able to do some of the things that China did. China, 3 or 4 years ago, reined in its tech oligarchs. And at the time, it was like, oh, China innovation is over. And now we see China taking over the electric car markets. We see China seeming to catch up very quickly in artificial intelligence. We see China going leaps and bounds in chips. It turns out, in fact, that while personal greed can be very, very motivating, it also needs to be balanced with some sensible planning, some actual protection of real competition instead of just going for oligarchies and monopolies. So I was wrong. Here's something I'm disputing with 7 years ago myself. We can't just rely on our immigration engine. The most important thing for U.S. success, for the survival of U.S. empire, is to demolish the U.S. military-industrial complex. It is to dramatically scale down the amount of money we waste on this now $1 trillion a year military-industrial complex. We need to actually talk about maintaining peace instead of setting up all these little macro Sudetenlands, Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan, that seem, are forced into this model by the military-industrial complex where they seem to just exist to start wars. We need to stop doing that stuff. We need to discard great power competition. We need a national security strategy that isn't based around giving the Pentagon something to do. Because giving the Pentagon something to do, from Vietnam to Iraq to 9/11 to Ukraine and everything in the Middle East for the past 20 years, is horrible for the United States. Sure, it's horrible for those regions, but it is horrible for the United States. Makes us weaker, stupider, and more in debt. We need to stop doing the military-industrial complex stuff. We need to stop hampering our immigration engine. But this is the added part over the past 7 years. We also need to reformat our economy more into a New Deal direction, more to a place where we're actually growing the economy and actually innovating again, instead of finding ways to make a bunch of Silicon Valley and other oligarchs a little bit richer. They don't need any more private islands. We can actually start taxing people again. We can actually do competition law again. We can actually start innovating in this country again instead of just making people rich. So yeah, there we go. That is how we can beat China, Iran, and everybody else. Hope you found that useful. Thanks. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and please consider signing up for our Patreon. If you do, you get 2 patrons-only presentations every month and access to the patrons-only Discord server. Thanks. That's angry. I'm cool with it, though.